Here's what Hollywood won't tell you about medieval assassins. Their most used tool wasn't a dagger or poison, it was luck. Because 9 times out of 10, their plans went horribly wrong. No smoke bombs, no grappling hooks, just a lot of improvising and praying they'd live to see breakfast. Tonight, we're tearing apart the assassin fantasy piece by piece. From their hilariously unreliable gear to their non-existent pensions, you'll see why this was the worst gig in history. Trust me, after this, you'll never complain about your job again. Picture this. You're a soldier who just got thrown out of your lord's service for pocketing a single silver coin. Or maybe you're a peasant whose entire family died in last winter's famine. Now you're standing in a muddy alley somewhere, staring at a pouch of someone else's money, and thinking this might be your only way to eat tomorrow. Welcome to the real recruitment process for medieval assassins. These weren't the sleek, calculating killers you see in movies. Historical records show most assassins were people who'd already lost everything: their land, their family, their place in society. That disgraced soldier? He probably didn't know the first thing about stealth kills. He just knew how to swing a sword badly, and that he needed food. The peasant-turned-killer? More likely to faint at the sight of blood than execute some perfect plan. Take one case from 14th century France. A former guard named Henri got caught stealing from his lord's treasury. Instead of facing execution, he ran. Next thing you know, he's taking contracts to kill minor nobles. Not because he's good at it, but because it was that or starve. Records show he botched his first 2 jobs before finally succeeding on the third, only to get stabbed by his own client who didn't want to pay. This wasn't some noble order of assassins. According to court documents, most assassins were peasants who could barely read, failed soldiers with minimal training, or thieves who'd lost their criminal networks. They weren't joining some cool secret society. They were desperate people taking dangerous work no one else would touch. Think of them like medieval gig workers, except every job might get you hanged. One account from Venice describes a thief named Marco who turned to assassination after his gang got caught and executed. He had decent knife skills from years of pickpocketing, but zero experience with actual murder. His first assassination attempt ended with him running away when the target sneezed unexpectedly. He eventually got better at it, right up until guards caught him hiding in a noble's wine cellar. The economics were brutal too. These weren't rich master criminals pulling strings from shadowy basements. Our Venetian thief Marco apparently lived in a rented room that kept getting flooded when the canals rose. The French soldier-turned-killer Henri reportedly wore the same patched tunic for 3 years straight. These people weren't in it for wealth or glory. They just needed to survive another week. Hollywood loves showing assassins as smooth operators who could retire after a few big jobs. Reality? Most didn't last 6 months. Either they got caught quickly, got stiffed by clients who then killed them, or realized too late they weren't cut out for murder. Historical records are full of one-hit wonders who tried assassination exactly once before meeting gruesome ends. Consider the case of a woman in medieval England who poisoned her abusive husband. Her first and only kill. She got caught immediately because she kept asking neighbors if they'd noticed him being sick yet. When arrested, she apparently seemed relieved it was over. That's how most assassin stories ended. Not with rooftop escapes, but with quick captures and public executions. The few who lasted more than a few jobs didn't fare much better. They weren't building careers. They were postponing their inevitable deaths while slowly going mad from guilt and paranoia. Imagine spending every meal wondering if this is the one where someone poisons you in return. Sleeping with a knife in your hand because you know at least 3 people want you dead. This wasn't a life anyone chose willingly. It was what happened when every other door slammed shut. No retirement plans, no health benefits. Just the grim knowledge that sooner or later, someone would come for you too. That former soldier Henri from France? He lasted barely 8 months before meeting the executioner. Our Venetian knife-for-hire Marco, found floating in the canals less than a year after his first kill. The truth is so much sadder than the fantasy. These weren't deadly artists mastering their craft over decades. They were hungry, scared people making terrible choices because society gave them no other options. Next time you see some glamorous assassin in a movie, Remember the reality. Broken people doing horrible things just to see another sunrise. Forget secret monasteries and ancient manuals. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspirational flute music in the background. Their training program was simple. Don't die the first few times you try. Take Pietro, a 15th century Italian butcher's son, who thought assassination sounded like easy money. His first job? Stabbing a merchant during a market crowd. He botched it spectacularly. Lunged too early, sliced a man's arm instead of his throat, then panicked and ran straight into a cart full of chickens. Somehow he escaped, but not before getting pecked bloody and losing a shoe. That was his training. No master whispered wisdom in his ear, just feathers in his hair, and the sudden understanding that this work was harder than it looked. Historical records show zero evidence of assassin guilds or schools. No manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings. If you learned anything, it was by watching other criminals fail first. Most assassins came with whatever skills they'd picked up elsewhere. Former soldiers knew basic combat. Thieves were good at sneaking. Farmers could handle a knife well enough to slaughter livestock. Then they adapted those skills through trial and mostly error. Consider Jacques, a French mercenary who switched to assassination when the wars ended. He knew how to swing a sword in formation, but nothing about stealth kills. His first solo contract ended with him loudly falling through a noble skylight, breaking both his ankles and the element of surprise. He lived, barely, and learned two things: check your footing and maybe stick to open combat. That's how assassin training worked. Not lectures on poison chemistry, but broken bones teaching painful lessons. The lucky few found temporary mentors among thieves or other killers, but these relationships rarely lasted. As one source puts it, mentoring was rare and short-lived because assassins don't retire, they disappear. You might pick up a trick or two before your teacher got hanged or vanished. One English apprentice reportedly learned how to pick locks from an old burglar, only to return next week and find a man's head on a pike. Lesson learned: don't get attached. Success didn't come from training. It came from survival. The assassins who lasted weren't the most skilled, just the ones who learned fast from their mistakes. Like Giovanna, a Spanish widow who poisoned 3 husbands before branching into contract kills. Her first professional attempt failed when her target spit out the doctor wine. She barely escaped the resulting chase, hid in a pigsty for 2 days, and emerged with one new rule: always use faster-acting toxins. Even successful assassins had shockingly low standards. In 14th century Germany, a killer named Dietrich became locally famous for his efficiency, until court records revealed his secret. He only took jobs against drunk or elderly targets, and even then succeeded maybe half the time. His reputation came from being one of the few who lived long enough for people to remember his name. The myth of master assassins passing down ancient techniques falls apart when you see what they actually did. Most kills were messy, improvised affairs. Poisons were whatever herbs the local wise woman would sell you. Weapons were repurposed tools, kitchen knives, fireplace pokers, sometimes just rocks and socks. Training meant remembering which mistakes nearly got you killed last time. Take the infamous case of the Assassin of Bruges, who terrorized local merchants for 5 months in 1372. When finally caught, his toolkit contained one stolen dagger, half a bottle of questionable poison, later proved to be mostly vinegar, and a rope with obvious chew marks where he tried to bite through it during a previous escape. This wasn't a trained killer. This was a desperate man figuring things out as he went. Modern forensics suggests most medieval assassinations failed somewhere between planning and execution. Targets moved rooms without warning. Guards changed shifts unpredictably. Poisons either worked too slowly or killed the user first. Every step was a potential disaster, and the only training was surviving each catastrophe slightly wiser than before. That's why so many assassins didn't last. No amount of on-the-job learning could prepare them for the countless ways things could go wrong. Records show most were caught within their first 3 attempts, assuming they survived the first one. Of the handful who lasted longer, few reached old age. The profession didn't so much hone your skills as whittle down your options until luck or the executioner caught up with you. Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. The training program? Stay alive until you figure it out. Graduation day? Usually the gallows. Here's the section. Imagine you've just successfully killed some noble's rival. You're waiting in the agreed-upon spot for your payment, trying not to bleed on your only decent shirt. The coins never come. Instead, you hear footsteps behind you and realize too late that your employer brought friends. This wasn't a payout. It was a cleanup operation. Welcome to the financial reality of medieval assassins, where payment was a myth and survival was the real bonus. Hollywood loves showing assassins swimming in gold after one job. Reality? Most got stiff more often than paid. Take the case of a German killer, named Klaus in 1423. He poisoned a merchant's wine as agreed, then waited by the city gates for his silver. What he got was 2 crossbow bolts to the chest. The merchant had survived. He'd hired a food taster Klaus didn't know about, and decided Klaus was now a liability. That's how most contracts ended. Not with a bag of coins, but with a knife in the dark. Records show payment was always conditional. The phrase, when the job is done, really meant, if you don't get caught, if the target actually dies, and if I feel like paying you. One French assassin's diary from 1386 complains about completing 7 jobs, but only getting paid for 3. The other 4 clients either vanished or sent armed men to discuss adjustments to their agreement. His solution? Start demanding half up front. This worked exactly once before someone poisoned him during the money handoff. Even when assassins got paid, it was never enough. A decent contract might pay enough to live on for a month, if you didn't mind sleeping in barns and eating moldy bread. That Spanish widow Giovanna from earlier? Her poison gig paid just enough to buy more poison. No retirement funds, no hazard pay, just enough to keep you desperate enough to take the next job. One account describes an English assassin who celebrated his payout by buying a hot meal and new boots, only get stabbed that same night by a rival who wanted the boots. Some clients set up entire sting operations. In 1391 Venice, a nobleman hired an assassin to kill his business partner. What the killer didn't know, the target was actually the nobleman's cousin, and the whole thing was a test. The moment the assassin drew his knife, guards swarmed him. The noble got bragging rights for catching a killer. The cousin got a promotion, and the assassin got the traditional Venetian punishment: weighted boots and a deep canal. The poorest assassins worked for food, not coins. Court records mention a starving peasant in 15th century England who agreed to stab a local lord for a wheel of cheese and 2 chickens. He botched the job, got the cheese confiscated as evidence, and was hanged with the chickens still clucking in their cage below the gallows. Another in France took a job just to get his creditor off his back, then got killed by that same creditor when he asked for actual money instead of just debt forgiveness. Surviving records show most assassins couldn't even afford proper weapons. That German killer Klaus? His poison was mostly crushed beetles mixed with vinegar. The Venetian who got canal justice? His dagger was a repurposed kitchen knife with half its handle missing. These weren't professionals with expense accounts. They were broke people using whatever they could steal. One assassin in York reportedly tried to kill a tax collector with a sharpened spoon. It went as well as you'd expect. The smart ones knew better than to trust promises. A rare success story comes from a Burgundian assassin named Matthew in 1415. He demanded payment in land instead of coins, specifically a small farm outside Dijon. The client agreed, figuring Matthew wouldn't live to claim it. But Matthew survived the job, showed up with a contract in hand, and actually got his farm. Then he got murdered by the client's son 6 months later. Even when you won, you lost. Why did anyone take these jobs? Because hunger is a powerful motivator. That Yerk Spoon assassin? He'd been a baker before the plague wiped out his customers. The French dead assassin? His children hadn't eaten in 3 days when he took the job. These weren't career choices. They were acts of desperation by people with no options left. One assassin's last words before execution were reportedly, "At least the rats in this cell are edible." The system was rigged from the start. Wealthy clients knew assassins couldn't sue for breach of contract. Killers couldn't exactly march into court and demand their unpaid wages. Some tried creative solutions, like the assassin who left detailed notes about his client's crimes in a church confessional before attempting the job. The priest turned him in immediately. Another sent blackmail letters after getting stiffed, only to discover his client was illiterate. In the end, assassination wasn't a path to wealth. It was a poverty trap. The few who got paid usually blew it on survival basics or lost it to better thieves. The rest died waiting for coins that would never come. That's why the profession had such high turnover. Not because the work was deadly, but because the pay was worse than the risk. Next time you see a movie assassin flashing gold coins, remember the reality. Most ended up face down in a ditch with empty pockets and very poor life choices. Here's the section. Imagine you've just successfully killed some noble's rival. You're waiting in the agreed-upon spot for your payment, trying not to bleed on your only decent shirt. The coins never come. Instead, you hear footsteps behind you and realize too late that your employer brought friends. This wasn't a payout. It was a cleanup operation. Welcome to the financial reality of medieval assassins, where payment was a myth and survival was the real bonus. Hollywood loves showing assassins swimming in gold after one job. Reality? Most got stiffed more often than paid. Take the case of a German killer, named Klaus in 1423. He poisoned a merchant's wine as agreed, then waited by the city gates for his silver. What he got was 2 crossbow bolts to the chest. The merchant had survived. He'd hired a food taster Klaus didn't know about, and decided Klaus was now a liability. That's how most contracts ended. Not with a bag of coins, but with a knife in the dark. Records show payment was always conditional. The phrase, when the job is done, really meant, if you don't get caught, if the target actually dies, and if I feel like paying you. One French assassin's diary from 1386 complains about completing 7 jobs, but only getting paid for 3. The other 4 clients either vanished or sent armed men to discuss adjustments to their agreement. His solution? Start demanding half up front. This worked exactly once before someone poisoned him during the money handoff. Even when assassins got paid, it was never enough. A decent contract might pay enough to live on for a month, if you didn't mind sleeping in barns and eating moldy bread. That Spanish widow Giovanna from earlier? Her poison gig paid just enough to buy more poison. No retirement funds, no hazard pay, just enough to keep you desperate enough to take the next job. One account describes an English assassin who celebrated his payout by buying a hot meal and new boots, only get stabbed that same night by a rival who wanted the boots. Some clients set up entire sting operations. In 1391 Venice, a nobleman hired an assassin to kill his business partner. What the killer didn't know, the target was actually the nobleman's cousin, and the whole thing was a test. The moment the assassin drew his knife, guards swarmed him. The noble got bragging rights for catching a killer. The cousin got a promotion, and the assassin got the traditional Venetian punishment: weighted boots and a deep canal. The poorest assassins worked for food, not coins. Court records mention a starving peasant in 15th century England who agreed to stab a local lord for a wheel of cheese and 2 chickens. He botched the job, got the cheese confiscated as evidence, and was hanged with the chickens still clucking in their cage below the gallows. Another in France took a job just to get his creditor off his back, then got killed by that same creditor when he asked for actual money instead of just debt forgiveness. Surviving records show most assassins couldn't even afford proper weapons. That German killer Klaus? His poison was mostly crushed beetles mixed with vinegar. The Venetian who got canal justice? His dagger was a repurposed kitchen knife with half its handle missing. These weren't professionals with expense accounts. They were broke people using whatever they could steal. One assassin in York reportedly tried to kill a tax collector with a sharpened spoon. It went as well as you'd expect. The smart ones knew better than to trust promises. A rare success story comes from a Burgundian assassin named Matthew in 1415. He demanded payment in land instead of coins, specifically a small farm outside Dijon. The client agreed, figuring Matthew wouldn't live to claim it. But Matthew survived the job, showed up with a contract in hand, and actually got his farm. Then he got murdered by the client's son 6 months later. Even when you won, you lost. Why did anyone take these jobs? Because hunger is a powerful motivator. That Yerk Spoon assassin? He'd been a baker before the plague wiped out his customers. The French dead assassin? His children hadn't eaten in 3 days when he took the job. These weren't career choices. They were acts of desperation by people with no options left. One assassin's last words before execution were reportedly, "At least the rats in this cell are edible." The system was rigged from the start. Wealthy clients knew assassins couldn't sue for breach of contract. Killers couldn't exactly march into court and demand their unpaid wages. Some tried creative solutions, like the assassin who left detailed notes about his client's crimes in a church confessional before attempting the job. The priest turned him in immediately. Another sent blackmail letters after getting stiffed, only to discover his client was illiterate. In the end, assassination wasn't a path to wealth. It was a poverty trap. The few who got paid usually blew it on survival basics or lost it to better thieves. The rest died waiting for coins that would never come. That's why the profession had such high turnover. Not because the work was deadly, but because the pay was worse than the risk. Next time you see a movie assassin flashing gold coins, remember the reality. Most ended up face down in a ditch with empty pockets and very poor life choices. You'd think nobles made easy targets, lounging around their castles waiting to be murdered. In reality, killing one was like trying to rob a bank that moves rooms every night and has a moat. These people didn't get rich by being careless. Every meal was tasted, every bedroom had guards, and half the beds were decoys. That assassin who spent weeks planning the perfect bedroom strike, he stabbed an empty mattress while the real target watched from a hidden door, laughing as guards dragged him away. Let's talk about the food situation first. Poison sounds like a clean solution until you realize every noble employed professional chewers. People whose only job was eating each course before their master did. One bishop employed 3 tasters for every meal, making them wait an hour between servings just to be sure. An assassin in 14th century Lyon learned this the hard way when his poison wine got tested on a servant who immediately collapsed. The bishop wasn't even in the building. He'd sent servants ahead as decoys. The would-be killer spent his last moments discovering the hard way that medieval castles had very deep oubliettes. Then there were the guards. Not just a couple sleepy guys at the gate, but rotating shifts of armed men who knew every inch of property. A castle ledger from 1387 shows one lord employed 60 full-time guards, with 12 on duty at any given hour. That's 12 pairs of eyes watching every hallway, courtyard, and privy. One assassin in Burgundy thought he'd outsmart them by disguising himself as a guardsman. It worked until his actual shift assignment came, standing watch over the kitchens all night. He got caught trying to abandon his post to find the target. Nobles didn't even sleep in predictable places. Many kept multiple identical bedrooms and rotated between them randomly. You could bribe a servant to learn which room Duke Heinrich used last Tuesday, only to break in and find his teenage son practicing lute in there instead. That exact scenario happened in 1412 Frankfurt. The assassin panicked, bludgeoned the kid with said lute, and was immediately tackled by guards who'd been stationed outside every single bedroom. The Duke had instituted this system after his own brother got stabbed in bed a year earlier. Security extended beyond the castle walls. Traveling nobles brought entire retinues, armed escorts, advanced scouts checking routes, even servants who'd sleep outside their doored inns. An English assassin in 1395 thought he had the perfect highway ambush planned, until his target's party arrived with 30 mounted knights and 2 war dogs. His last words were reportedly, "I thought he was just visiting his mother," spoken right before the dog got to him. Banquets presented another nightmare. Sure, the target would be sitting still for hours, but so would 200 witnesses, plus guards at every exit. Ever tried discreetly poisoning someone while jugglers perform and servants constantly refill goblets? One idiot in Paris did. He spent 3 hours maneuvering to reach the Count's table, only to realize too late that all the wine came from the same decanter, being guarded by an armored knight with a very large axe. He still attempted to pour. The axe won. Disguises barely worked either. Medieval communities were small and tight-knit. Strangers stood out instantly. That assassin who thought dressing as a pilgrim would help? Real pilgrims traveled in groups, knew specific prayers, and didn't carry suspicious bulges under their robes. He lasted 20 minutes inside the castle gates before guards noticed he kept adjusting his belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. Apparently, genuine pilgrims didn't do that. Even successful hits rarely went as planned. Consider the infamous case of Lord Pembroke's assassination in 1401. The killer had infiltrated the household as a stable hand. Legitimately, having actually worked with horses before, he waited months for the perfect moment. Then, during a chaotic hunt, he cornered the lord alone, only to discover Pembroke slept in chainmail under his clothes. The first stab glanced off. The second got tangled in the lord's cloak. By the third attempt, the hunting party had circled back and were thoroughly amused by the spectacle. The few assassinations that succeeded usually involved astronomical luck, like the time a drunk noble in 1432 Venice tripped onto his own ceremonial dagger during an argument, conveniently while standing next to a known assassin who immediately got blamed, or the French baron who choked on a fish bone right after firing his food taster. For every carefully planned murder that worked, 20 failed spectacularly because nobles weren't stupid. They knew people wanted them dead and planned accordingly. This wasn't hitman work. It was playing reverse lottery where survival meant beating impossible odds. Most assassins never got close enough to attempt to kill. Those who did usually discover their plan failed at the first real obstacle. The handful who succeeded, they probably tripped into it by accident while trying something else entirely. Next time you see some smooth-talking cinematic assassin infiltrate a castle like it's nothing, remember, real medieval killers were more likely to get stuck in a murder hole than actually murder anyone. Picture this. You just pulled off your first successful kill. The adrenaline fades. Now comes the hard part, living with it. Medieval assassins didn't get to retire to some sunny villa. They either died young or spent the rest of their lives jumping at shadows. Every unfamiliar face could be the person coming to settle the score. Every meal might be your last. This wasn't a career with benefits. It was a slow walk to gallows or a lonely death in some ditch. Take the case of a French assassin named Luc in 1412. He completed 7 jobs without getting caught, a miracle by medieval standards. But instead of getting rich, he developed insomnia so severe he hallucinated guards in every doorway. Eventually, he fled to a monastery, only to get recognized by a traveling merchant who'd seen his wanted poster. His last journal entry reads, "I haven't slept through the night in 3 years. The brothers here say God forgives killers. I wish someone had told my clients." The statistics were brutal. Court records from 14th century England show 80% of known assassins were caught within 2 years of their first kill. Most didn't even make it that long. The lucky ones got executed quickly. The unlucky ones spent years looking over their shoulders, never staying in one place long enough to make friends. A German killer named Dieter lasted 4 years by changing towns every few months. He got caught when a tavern keeper recognized his distinctive limp, an old wound from a botched job, and turned him in for the bounty. Even successful assassins had to disappear. There are accounts of killers faking their own deaths. Badly, one Venetian stabbed himself shallowly, threw his clothes in canal, and limped to a new city. It worked for 6 months until he ran into his former client at a market. The client wasn't pleased to see a dead man buying onions. Another tried becoming a hermit in the Alps, only to get murdered by bandits who didn't care about his past, just the coins in his belt. The worst part? The people who hired you often became your biggest threat. After all, who better to tie up loose ends than the man who knows how to make people disappear? A Burgundian assassin named Gerard survived 12 jobs before his own client hired someone to kill him. The irony wasn't lost on Gerard. He'd taught that client how to find reliable killers years earlier. His body was found with a note. Paid in full. Nightmares came with the territory. Records from a 15th century Spanish monastery mention an anonymous confessor who kept waking up screaming about the merchant's eyes. Turned out he'd been an assassin before taking vows. The other monks eventually drove him out, not for his past, but because no one could sleep through his nightly terrors. He disappeared into the mountains and was presumably eaten by wolves. Some tried going straight, with mixed results. An English assassin named Wood switched to farming after his last job went bad. He lasted 2 harvests before a traveling tax collector recognized him, what killed a man in his field, then realized he'd just proven he could never leave the life. He hanged himself in his barn the next day. The isolation destroyed many before the executioners could. Assassins couldn't trust anyone, not lovers, not drinking buddies, certainly not family. A Florentine killer known only as Lorenzo the Ghost reportedly hadn't spoken to another human in 5 years when guards caught him. He'd been communicating with clients via notes left in church confessionals. When arrested, he seemed almost relieved to finally have someone to talk to, even if it was his executioner. Security measures were laughable by modern standards. One assassin slept with a tether around his ankle connected to a bucket of nails. If anyone opened his door, the noise would wake him. It worked exactly once before the bucket got stuck, and he broke his leg trying to flee. Another carried a dead man switch, a letter naming all his clients that would be delivered if he died. His client solved that problem by paying the messenger to burn it. Old age was the rarest death of all. The few who survived long enough to go gray usually did so as broken men. There's an account of a 60-year-old former assassin living in a Dover shack in 1431. Neighborhood children threw rocks at his windows because legend said he'd steal your breath if you got too close. He died alone with a knife in one hand and a list of names in the other, whether targets or clients. No one could say. The psychological toll showed in odd ways. Some developed tics, constant neck rubbing to check for nooses, or refusing to sit with their back to doors. Others turned to drink. One Parisian assassin drank himself to death within a year of retiring because, as his landlord put it, the quiet drove him mad. Even geography couldn't save you. An assassin who fled to Scotland changed his name and married a local woman. 15 peaceful years later, his new brother-in-law recognized him from an old wanted poster during a drinking game. The family turned him in for the reward money. His wife kept the coins but refused to attend the hanging. The real kicker? Most of these men weren't even good at killing to begin with. The ones who lived longest did so by being forgettable, not fearsome. A Spanish assassin named Rodrigo survived a decade by only taking small jobs, minor merchants, unpopular priests. When finally caught, the judge laughed at his pathetic kill list. Rodrigo's response? Better a live coward than a dead legend. They hanged him anyway. So no, medieval assassins didn't retire to enjoy their golden years. They either died quickly or spent what little time they had jumping at every knock on the door. The life promised nothing and delivered less. Next time you see some grizzled movie assassin drinking alone in a tavern, remember that wasn't a choice. It was the job. Here's your section. Forget secret handshakes and shadowy guilds. Medieval assassins didn't have a brotherhood. They had a survival rate lower than a candle in a rainstorm. The closest thing to a network was the occasional shared glance with another desperate soul before you both pretended you didn't exist. This wasn't profession with camaraderie. It was you, your rusty knife, and the growing certainty that everyone around you would sell you out for half a loaf of bread. Take the case of a French assassin named Gilles in 1398. He made the fatal mistake of trusting another killer he met in a tavern. They teamed up for one job, a simple poisoning. Gilles handled the toxin while his new partner scouted the target's routines. Except the partner was actually working for the target's family. Gilles woke up chained to a wall with his own poison vial shoved down his throat. His last words? I should have worked alone. Historical records show assassins almost never formed lasting partnerships. The few who tried usually ended up like Gilles, dead by betrayal. One account from 15th century Germany describes 2 killers who teamed up to murder a merchant. They succeeded, then immediately turned on each other when the payment arrived. The survivor didn't even make it to the city gates before guards caught him covered in his partner's blood. Clients were even worse than fellow assassins. Many hired multiple killers for the same job as insurance. You might think you're the only one stalking Lord whatever his name, only to find some other desperate idiot creeping through the same garden at midnight. Worse, clients often hired a second assassin to kill the first one after the job, eliminating loose ends. A Venetian ledger from 1423 lists payments to to 3 different killers for the same target. The first 2 disappeared mysteriously after collecting their deposits. The third got smart and fled the city with the money before attempting to hit. Even criminal networks kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers wanted nothing to do with assassins. Too much heat, too much risk. A burglar in 14th century London once described assassins as walking play cards. You might survive working with them, but why chance it? The few did business with killers charged outrageous fees for basic help. That same burglar reportedly charged an assassin 10 times his normal rate, just for a set of lockpicks, then tipped off the guards anyway. The isolation warped their minds. Without allies to watch their backs, assassins developed crippling paranoia. One Spanish killer in 1415 dug a hidden compartment under his floorboard to sleep in, then accidentally suffocated himself when the supports collapsed. Another in Germany refused to eat anything he hadn't personally gathered from the woods. He died chewing on poisonous mushrooms, which at least solved his trust issues permanently. Some tried creating their own support systems with predictable results. A pair of English assassins in 1432 came up with a buddy system. Each would hold compromising information about the other to ensure mutual loyalty. It worked until one got captured and immediately spilled everything to save his own skin. The other was found hanged in his cell with a note. Never make friends in this business. Family was off limits too. Smart assassins cut ties completely. One Italian killer in 1387 made the mistake of visiting his sister after a job. She recognized his voice through his disguise, a flour sack with eye holes, and turned him in for the reward. Another in France sent money to his mother through intermediaries until she used the payment trail to lead guards to his hideout. Her defense? He was a bad son. The rare exceptions proved the rule. 2 brothers in 15th century Flanders allegedly worked together successfully for years. Their secret? They only took jobs where the target was already dying, then collected payment for speeding things along. Even that fell apart when one brother got greedy and poisoned the other over a disputed share. The survivor was caught trying to collect both payouts. Why such distrust? Because assassins were walking liabilities. Every person who knew your face was a potential witness. Every shared drink could be your last. A German account from 1405 describes an assassin who survived 7 years by never sleeping in the same place twice. He finally got caught because a tavern maid remembered he always ordered the same meal, roast pork with extra salt. Guards staked out every in serving that dish for a week. The job's nature required complete anonymity. Assassins didn't sign their work or leave calling cards. Successful kills were attributed to mysterious illness or bandits. The killer's name died with the target. One French noble's diary from 1393 complains about paying good money for an assassination, then having no one to brag to about it. The assassin already vanished into the countryside, probably mumbling to himself about trust issues. Modern hitmen face similar isolation, but at least they have burner phones. Medieval assassins had to rely on coded messages left in church confessionals or scribbled on tavern walls. Half the time, the wrong person found them. A Burgundian killer in 1421 arranged a meeting via coded symbols scratched into a market stall. He arrived to find 6 armed men, his client's enemies who cracked the code first. In the end, the only reliable strategy was working alone and trusting no one. That German assassin, who survived 7 years? His final journal entry reads, "The pork was worth it. They found him dead in a ditch 3 days later. Natural causes, ironically. No allies to mourn him. No enemies gloating. Just another nameless corpse in an era full of them. So no, there was no brotherhood of assassins. Just a lot of lonely, paranoid people realizing too late that in this line of work, your best friend was a knife at your belt, and even that might turn on you. Medieval villagers didn't just fear assassins. They thought they crawled out of some helpet with demon blood in their veins. These weren't just killers to them. They were walking bad omens who made cows stop giving milk, and babies born with extra fingers. The moment someone turned up dead with no obvious explanation, fingers immediately pointed at the nearest shady character carrying suspicious herbs or foreign coins. Forget logic. This was an era where people blamed cheese for bad dreams and owls for dead relatives. Take what happened in a French village in 1387. After 3 children died of fever in 1 week, the locals dragged a traveling knife sharpener to the town square. Why him? Because he had shifty eyes and once sharpened a butcher's cleaver that later killed a pig. Never mind that pig died from eating rotten apples. They tied the man to a post and burned him anyway, just in case he'd sent some assassins curse their way. His screams apparently stopped the moment the flames touched him, which villagers took as proof he'd been in league with the devil all along. The superstitions ran so deep that merely knowing an assassin could ruin your life. There's an account from Germany in 1392 where an entire family got chased out of town because their cousin once shared a drink with a known killer. Never mind that cousin had been dead for years. The taint lasted generations. The family's house got torn down for good measure, their fields salted, and their names scratched from the church records. Historical documents show this happened surprisingly often. Any connection to assassins, no matter how distant, made you a social leper. Poison only made things worse for their reputation. In an age where doctors prescribed mercury and ground up skulls as medicine, anything that could kill quietly seemed like black magic. One Italian assassin in 1415 got caught with a vial of what was probably just hemlock extract. At his trial, 3 separate witnesses swore they'd seen him gathering the ingredients during a lunar eclipse while chanting in the tongue of demons. The judge, who'd studied actual medicine in Bologna, pointed out the vial contained common garden plants. They hanged him for witchcraft anyway, because the crowd was getting restless. Assassins didn't help their own case by leaning into the rumors sometimes. A Spanish killer in the 1420 spread stories. He could turn invisible by drinking bat blood. It worked beautifully until he tried robbing a monastery, and a novice monk whacked him with a stool. The monk later said he hadn't seen the assassin. He just smelled the bat blood and swung blindly. They made the monk a bishop eventually. Tools of the trade might as well have been cursed artifacts. A dagger wasn't just a weapon. Villagers believe assassins forged their blades in unholy fires, using the bones of unbaptized children. One English assassin in 1401 actually used this fear to his advantage, letting rumors spread that his knife could kill with a single scratch. Lords paid him extra not to use it on them. Worked great until a blacksmith examined the blade and found it was just cheap iron with rat guts smeared on it for effect. The blacksmith took the knife and stabbed the assassin with it to test the curse. The man died from infection 3 weeks later, proving nothing. The isolation bred more superstitions. An assassin living alone in the woods wasn't just hiding. People assumed he was doing dark rituals. There's an account from Burgundy in 1431 where hunters found a hermit's cabin full of drying herbs and odd symbols carved into the walls. Turned out the hermit was just bad at wood carving and liked tea, but the hunters swore the symbols moved when they looked away. They burned the cabin with the hermit inside. Later examination showed the symbols were just poorly drawn rabbits. Even failed assassins fed the legends. After one botched poisoning attempt in 1398 Venice, the would-be killer jumped into a canal to escape. When guards pulled him out, he was covered in strange green algae. The city immediately blamed him for that month's spoiled wine shipments, even though the barrels had clearly just gotten too warm. They executed him by tying him to a barrel of the cursed wine and rolling it into the sea. His last words were apparently, "But I don't even drink." Surviving records show assassins often got blamed for completely unrelated disasters. A fire that destroyed half of London in 1415? Obviously an assassin's curse, despite evidence it started in a baker's oven. A stillborn calf in some rural village must have looked at an assassin wrong. There was no catastrophe too small or unlikely that couldn't be pinned on these supposed dark apostles. The fear followed them beyond death too. Graves of known assassins were routinely dug up and their bones scattered, not to prevent resurrection, but because people believed their spirits could poison the earth. One town in France kept exhuming the same assassin skeleton every 5 years for nearly a century until someone finally tossed the bones in a river. Then when fish died downstream the following week, guess who got blamed posthumously? Oddly enough, this reputation sometimes worked in their favor briefly. A few smart assassins realized nobles would pay extra just to keep them away from their lands, no killing required, like the German who traveled from town to town in 1412, letting rumors precede him about his terrible power. Lords would slip him coins at the gates just to make him go elsewhere. He retired comfortably on this scam until one brave priest called his bluff and punched him in the face. The assassin reportedly started crying and confessed he was just a failed barrel maker. They hanged him anyway because the crowd felt cheated. In the end, the superstitions guaranteed no happy endings. Even if an assassin survived all the actual dangers of the job, he'd still spend his life watching neighbors cross themselves when he walked by. Children would run screaming from him. Animals would inexplicably dislike him. Not because of any curse, but because desperate men who haven't bathed in weeks tend to smell bad. The legends outlive the facts every time. Next time you see some mystical assassin in fantasy fiction, remember the reality. Medieval killers were more likely to get stoned for giving someone an evil eye than to actually pull off any magic. Poison sounded like the perfect weapon, silent, invisible, untraceable. The problem? Medieval poison was about as subtle as a brick to the face. Forget fancy potions and delicate vials. Most killers work with whatever rotting plant matter they could scrounge up, mixed in a hurry by someone who barely knew which end of the spoon to use. Take the case of an English assassin in 1381 who tried to poison a lord's wine. He used the wrong mushroom. The target just got violently ill, and the assassin got caught because he'd also touched the poison barehanded. His hands blistered so badly he couldn't hold his defense sword at trial. The main issue was dosage. Without modern chemistry, assassins played a guessing game with every batch. That green sludge might kill a man, or just give him diarrhea. Records from 14th century Venice show one noble survived 3 separate poisoning attempts because each assassin had underestimated how much wolfsbane it took to overwhelm his massive wine consumption. The 4th assassin finally succeeded by using enough poison to kill a horse, which the chambermaid noticed floating in the wine like swamp scum. She still got a reward for catching the killer before the noble actually drank it. Storage was another disaster. Glass vials broke. Moisture ruined powders. One French assassin carried his deadly toxin in a poorly sealed animal bladder that leaked onto his leg. He woke up halfway through the job with his entire thigh numb. When guards caught him limping away, he confessed immediately, not out of guilt, but because he thought the poison was creeping toward his heart. The physician later determined it was just bad honey that had fermented. Taste was poison's biggest giveaway. Nobles weren't idiots. If their wine suddenly tasted like bitter almonds or their meat had a metallic tang, they'd stop eating. An assassin in 1415 Germany tried masking hemlock with strong spices. His target took one sip of the specially seasoned wine and spat across the table. The resulting commotion revealed 7 other guests had also been given poisoned drinks. The would-be killer got torn apart by the mob before the guards could intervene. Delivery methods often failed spectacularly. That classic move of poisoning a dagger, more likely to kill the wielder. A Spanish assassin in 1392 coated his blade in some homemade concoction, then cut himself while sheathing it. He spent the next 3 days hallucinating that spiders were crawling under his skin while the target went hunting untouched. Guards eventually found the assassin hiding in a tree, trying to shake off the spiders. He fell to his death before they could arrest him. Even success came with problems. Poison left evidence. Unlike a knife wound, you couldn't just wipe off the murder weapon. One killer in 15th century Florence thought he'd been clever using untraceable nightshade. Then the victim's dog licked the corpse and died the same way. Suspicious monks preserved both bodies and proved they'd been poisoned by feeding extracts to rats. The assassin had already fled, but they hanged his identical cousin by mistake. Nobody corrected the record. The few reliable poisons were too obvious. Arsenic left white residue. Belladonna dilated pupils visibly. A Burgundian noble in 1379 caught his would-be poisoner because the servant bringing his wine kept staring at his eyes. When challenged, the servant panicked and drank the wine himself to prove it was safe. He died thrashing as the noble watched. This became standard practice. Once one noble started demanding servants taste everything, all the others copied. You'd think this made poisoning impossible, Yet somehow assassins kept trying. Accidental poisonings outnumbered successful murders. An Italian cook in 1432 accidentally used toxic mushrooms in a sauce meant only for his master. 12 people died, including the assassin who bribed him. The cook survived because he'd been tasting for seasoning and only ate small amounts. They still executed him, but only after he recovered enough to walk to the gallows. Herbal knowledge often backfired. One assassin in 1408 England gathered what he thought was deadly water hemlock. Turned out to be wild parsnip. His target ate the poisoned meal heartily while the assassin watched in confusion through a window. The noble later complained about stomach cramps in his diary, then lived another 20 years. The assassin got caught because he kept returning to the garden trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong. Groups had even worse luck with poison. A trio of assassins in 1394 France all contributed different ingredients to make the perfect untraceable toxin. One brought ergot, another lead powder, the third mercury. The resulting mixture exploded when heated, blowing a hole in their rented room. Debris injured 5 bystanders, who then helped identify all 3 would-be killers. The judge noted their poison was about as subtle as a trumpet announcing the murder. Climate ruined many attempts. Heat spoiled liquids. Cold made powders clump. An assassin in 1421 Norway stored his poison near a fireplace to keep it flowing in winter. The heat broke it down into harmless sludge. His target drank the entire Dr. flagon with no effect beyond slight drunkenness. The killer was caught trying to steal more poison ingredients from an apothecary who recognized the recipe. Even nobility struggled with poison. When a duke's son tried poisoning his father in 1435, he used a rare Indian toxin bought from a traveling merchant. Too rare. The unusual symptoms told physicians exactly what to test for. The son had his hands cut off before execution to prevent further experiments. This became standard punishment for poisoners, most of whom had much less noble motives. Why did anyone use poison then? Because when it worked, it really worked. One drop of properly prepared monkshood in the right drink, and your target dropped dead with no messy struggle. The trick was acquiring that knowledge without poisoning yourself first. An assassin in 15th century Prague took 20 years to perfect his craft, then died testing a new batch. His notes show he'd survived 7 near-fatal accidents before that final mistake. The worst part? Many targets deserved it. Corrupt lords, abusive clergymen, tyrannical merchants. Plenty of people had enemies who wanted them gone quietly. But poison was such an unreliable option that most would-be victims died of old age first. When assassination attempts did succeed, the killer usually got caught because poison leaves trails even medieval investigators could follow. That Venetian merchant who survived 3 attempts died naturally in his sleep at 80, haunted not by poisoners but by gout. His last words were a complaint about the weak wine his servants gave him, still suspicious after all those years. Poison wasn't an art. It was a desperate gamble where the house always won. For every successful silent murder, a dozen assassins wound up vomiting in ditches or explaining to guards why they carried suspicious powders. Even victors didn't win for long. The Florence killer who poisoned himself testing his work left behind a fitting epitaph scrawled in his notes. Should have just used a knife. Hollywood loves showing assassins making quick, silent kills before vanishing into the night. The reality was more like hacking at someone with a kitchen knife while they screamed bloody murder. There was nothing clean or elegant about medieval assassinations, just desperate up-close violence that left everyone traumatized. Take the case of an assassin in 14th century Paris who panicked mid-kill. He cornered his target in a stable, but when he went for the throat, the noble headbutted him hard enough to break his nose. Blood streamed down his face as they wrestled in the hay. The assassin finally won by biting the man's ear off and stabbing wildly until he hit something vital. Court scribes later noted the killer was found vomiting behind a barrel, his hands still shaking. Weapons failed constantly. A German assassin in 1378 tried using a stolen dagger. So rusty it been on the first stab. His target, a merchant, grabbed a nearby iron candlestick and beat him senseless. Guards arrived to find the would-be killer unconscious in a pool of his own blood next to the completely unharmed merchant, who was still clutching the candlestick and yelling about filthy, cut purses. Even successful kills were ugly. A Spanish killer's confession describes his first job: sneaking into a noble's bedchamber only to find a man awake and reaching for a sword. What followed wasn't some graceful duel, but a minute-long scrabble on the floor that ended with the assassin kneeing the noble in the groin and choking him with bedsheets. The noble bit through his tongue during the struggle, spraying blood everywhere. The assassin spent the next week picking dried blood flecks from his fingernails. Targets fought back harder than anyone expected. A Florentine assassin learned this when his easy mark, an elderly bishop, pulled a knife from his robes and nearly gutted him. The bishop had been a soldier in his youth and knew exactly where to stab. The assassin survived only because he fell backward out a window into a dung cart. Meanwhile, the bishop calmly had his wounds stitched while dictating letters about the incident. The aftermath was often worse than the killing itself. One English assassin in 1392 described how his victim's eyes locked onto his during the final moments, a detail that haunted his dreams for years. He started sleeping with a candle burning after waking up screaming too often. Another killer in France developed a twitch every time he saw blood, which made blending an impossible. Guards caught him because he couldn't stop flinching at butcher shops. Improvised weapons led to gruesome scenes. A Venetian assassin used a broken bottle because he couldn't afford a proper dagger. His target, a drunk merchant, took the jagged glass to the neck but kept fighting, spraying arterial blood across the tavern wall. The killer slipped in the growing pool of blood while trying to escape and broke his arm. He was still crawling toward the door when the city watch arrived. Sometimes the assassin lost the fight completely. A Burgundian noble's diary recounts how a hired killer burst into his chambers, only to get kicked squarely in the chest by the noble's much younger wife. While the assassin gasped for breath on the floor, the noble beat him with fireplace poker until guards arrived. The entry concludes: paid Maria a gold necklace for her quick thinking. The would-be murderer's teeth made an excellent bracelet. Post-kill cleanup was practically non-existent. Most assassins had to flee covered in blood, vomit, or whatever else had been nearby during the struggle. A killer in 15th century London reportedly hid in a pigsty for 3 days because his cloak was too blood-soaked to walk the streets. The pigs ate part of it before he could sneak away. The physical toll showed quickly. Court physicians noted that captured assassins often had scars from previous botch jobs, missing fingers, poorly set broken bones, even bite marks. One had a permanent limp from where a target's dog tore his calf muscle during an escape. Another was partially deaf in one ear after a noble smashed a wine jug over his head. Oddly enough, some targets pitted their attackers. A German abbot survived an assassination attempt when the killer's dagger snapped against his woolen robes. Instead of calling guards, the abbot set the would-be murderer down for a theological discussion that lasted until dawn. Records show the man joined the monastery soon after and died peacefully decades later, though he reportedly jumped at loud noises for the rest of his life. There were no cool one-liners or dramatic last words, just grunting, sobbing, and the wet sounds of poorly aimed stabs. A French assassin's journal describes his most successful kill taking 17 separate stab wounds because his hands were shaking so badly. The entry reads, "Got paid extra for the mess. Had to burn my shoes afterward." Clean kills were so rare, they became legends. A chronicle from 1431 mentions an assassin who somehow managed a single stab to the heart during a crowded feast. The target slumped over quietly, and the killer vanished before anyone noticed. The writer added this was only the third such case in living memory, compared to hundreds of documented messy, violent failures. The truth is medieval killers weren't masters of death. They were desperate people forced into ugly work. Next time you see some cinematic assassin slide a blade between ribs with poetic precision, remember reality. It was more likely a frantic minute of stabbing, biting, and hoping nobody heard the screaming. No artistry, no dignity, just survival at its rawest and most brutal. Here's your section. Forget secret handshakes and shadowy guilds. Medieval assassins didn't have a brotherhood. They had a survival rate lower than a candle in a rainstorm. The closest thing to a network was the occasional shared glance with another desperate soul before you both pretended you didn't exist. This wasn't a profession with camaraderie. It was you, your rusty knife, and the growing certainty that everyone around you would sell you out for half a loaf of bread. Take the case of a French assassin named Gillis in 1398. He made the fatal mistake of trusting another killer he met in a tavern. They teamed up for one job, a simple poisoning. Gillis handled the toxin while his new partner scouted the target's routines. Except the partner was actually working for the target's family. Gillis woke up chained to a wall with his own poison vial shoved down his throat. His last words? "I should have worked alone." Historical records show assassins almost never formed lasting partnerships. The few who tried usually ended up like Gillis, dead by betrayal. One account from 15th century Germany describes two killers who teamed up to murder a merchant. They succeeded, then immediately turned on each other when the payment arrived. The survivor didn't even make it to the city gates before guards caught him covered in his partner's blood. Clients were even worse than fellow assassins. Many hired multiple killers for the same job as insurance. You might think you're the only one stalking Lord whatever his name, only to find some other desperate idiot creeping through the same garden at midnight. Worse, clients often hired a second assassin to kill the first one after the job, eliminating loose ends. A Venetian ledger from 1423 lists payments to 3 different killers for the same target. The first 2 disappeared mysteriously after collecting their deposits. The third got smart and fled the city with the money before attempting to hit. Even criminal networks kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers wanted nothing to do with assassins. Too much heat, too much risk. A burglar in 14th century London once described assassins as walking plague carts. You might survive working with them, but why chance it? The few did business with killers charged outrageous fees for basic help. That same burglar reportedly charged an assassin 10 times his normal rate just for a set of lockpicks, then tipped off the guards anyway. The isolation warped their minds. Without allies to watch their backs, assassins developed crippling paranoia. One Spanish killer in 1415 dug a hidden compartment under his floorboards to sleep in, then accidentally suffocated himself when the supports collapsed. Another in Germany refused to eat anything he hadn't personally gathered from the woods. He died chewing on poisonous mushrooms, which at least solved his trust issues permanently. Some tried creating their own support systems with predictable results. A pair of English assassins in 1432 came up with a buddy system. Each would hold compromising information about the other to ensure mutual loyalty. It worked until one got captured and immediately spilled everything to save his own skin. The other was found hanged in his cell with a note. Never make friends in this business. Family was off limits too. Smart assassins cut ties completely. One Italian killer in 1387 made the mistake of visiting his sister after a job. She recognized his voice through his disguise, a flour sack with eye holes, and turned him in for the reward. Another in France sent money to his mother through intermediaries until she used the payment trail to lead guards to his hideout. Her defense? He was a bad son. The rare exceptions prove the rule. 2 brothers in 15th century Flanders allegedly worked together successfully for years. Their secret? They only took jobs where the target was already dying, then collected payment for speeding things along. Even that fell apart when one brother got greedy and poisoned the other over a disputed share. The survivor was caught trying to collect both payouts. Why such distrust? Because assassins were walking liabilities. Every person who knew your face was a potential witness. Every shared drink could be your last. A German account from 1405 describes an assassin who survived 7 years by never sleeping in the same place twice. He finally got caught because a tavern maid remembered he always ordered the same meal, roast pork with extra salt. Guards staked out every in serving that dish for a week. The job's nature required complete anonymity. Assassins didn't sign their work or leave calling cards. Successful kills were attributed to mysterious illness or bandits. The killer's name died with the target. One French noble's diary from 1393 complains about paying good money for an assassination, then having no one to brag to about it. The assassin already vanished into the countryside, probably mumbling to himself about trust issues. Modern hitmen face similar isolation, but at least they have burner phones. Medieval assassins had to rely on coded messages left in church confessionals or scribbled on tavern walls. Half the time, the wrong person found them. A Burgundian killer in 1421 arranged a meeting via coded symbols scratched into a market stall. He arrived to find 6 armed men, his client's enemies who'd cracked the code first. In the end, the only reliable strategy was working alone and trusting no one. That German assassin who survived 7 years? His final journal entry reads, "The pork was worth it." They found him dead in a ditch 3 days later. Natural causes, ironically. No allies to mourn him. No enemies gloating. Just another nameless corpse in an era full of them. So no, there was no brotherhood of assassins. Just a lot of lonely, paranoid people realizing too late that in this line of work, your best friend was the knife at your belt. And even that might turn on you. Imagine killing someone and then seeing their face every time you close your eyes. That wasn't just a bad night's sleep for medieval assassins. It was Tuesday. Take Guillaume, a French killer from 1415 who kept detailed journals. After his first job, he wrote about scrubbing blood from under his nail for hours, only to wake up the next morning seeing red stains that weren't there. His entries get progressively shorter until they're just one word repeated. Eyes. They found his body in a river with no wounds. The coroner wrote, "Drowned by ghosts as the cause of death." The act of killing messes with your head in ways no training prepares you for. One assassin in Florence couldn't stop flinching at the sound of laughter after his target giggled nervously right before dying. Another in London developed an uncontrollable twitch every time he touched metal. Not great when your whole livelihood depends on handling knives. Historical records are full of killers who cracked under the pressure long before anyone caught them. Isolation made it worse. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under the pillow. A Spanish assassin's diary describes pretending to have night terrors about work to explain his screams. His landlord eventually kicked him out because the neighbors thought he was possessed. The guy ended up paying a prostitute just to sit in his room while he slept, not for sex, just so someone would be there when he woke up gasping. Some tried to self-medicate. Alcohol was a popular choice, but that came with its own problems. A German assassin drank so much he started seeing his victims during daylight hours. He'd duck into alleys to avoid that merchant from Bremen, who'd been dead for 3 years. One night he attacked a barrel, thinking it was the ghost of his last target come for revenge. The barrel won. Guards found him unconscious in a puddle of wine and his own vomit. Religious guilt ate away at others. A killer in Venice anonymously donated all his earnings to churches, then kept taking more jobs to have money to give away. His confessor eventually recognized the pattern and turned him in. The arrest record notes his response. Thank God. They hanged him with a rosary around his neck that he'd apparently chewed through during the drop. The nightmares were worse than any physical wound. An English assassin described dreaming about his victims sitting around a banquet table, taking turns describing how he'd killed them. The worst part? They kept inviting him to join the meal. He stopped sleeping entirely for the last month of his life, which probably explains why he walked into an obvious ambush. His journal's final entry reads, "Going to see if the dream table has an empty chair." Some develop bizarre compulsions. One assassin in Paris washed his hands exactly 14 times after each kill until the day he ran out of water mid-count and had a screaming fit in the street. Guards investigating the noise found bloody rags in his room with 14 folds each. Another in Cologne couldn't step on cracks in pavement after his third job. He took so many detours to avoid them that clients assumed he'd skipped town. They put out contracts on him before he could even complete the kills. The stress showed in physical ways too. Excavated skeletons of known assassins often show teeth worn down to nubs from constant grinding. One in York had fingernails that grew inward from how tightly he clenched his fists for years. Another in Prague showed signs of malnutrition, not from lack of food, but because he couldn't keep meals down after kills. His landlady's testimony mentions the sound of him retching every morning like clockwork. A few tried to quit the life, but the memories followed. A Burgundian assassin became a shepherd after his last job, thinking the quiet would help. It didn't. Village children reported seeing him whispering to his flock at night, except he was actually arguing with people who weren't there. When wolves took one of his sheep, he screamed at the sky, "Take me next time!" The wolves apparently listened. They found his body a week later, with no visible wounds. The villagers buried him under a pile of rocks, just in case whatever got him wanted seconds. The smarter ones knew there was no way out. A German killer left notes about planning to drown himself after one more job. His last entry reads, "The water will be colder than his hands were." They found his boots by a riverbank with stones in them. The body never turned up. Maybe he succeeded. Maybe he's still out there somewhere, jumping at every ripple. In the end, assassination didn't just break bodies, it shattered minds. The ones who survived longest weren't the best killers. They were the best at compartmentalizing, like the Spanish assassin who wrote, "You don't forget the faces. You just learn to live with the screaming." He lasted 8 years before hanging himself with a garrote he'd taken off a victim. So no, medieval assassins weren't the cool, collected professionals from movies. They were men who jumped at shadows they'd put there themselves. Their careers didn't end with retirement parties. They ended with empty bottles, bloody prayer books, and whatever passed for peace in those fractured minds. The real tragedy wasn't how they died. It was how they had to live with what they'd done long before death took them. Fail as an assassin, and you didn't just die. You died in front of a cheering crowd with your intestines on display like sausage links. Medieval towns didn't just execute failed killers. They turned it into the worst reality show imaginable. Take the case of a French assassin in 1389 who got drawn and quartered. They tied each limb to a different horse, but the animals were poorly trained. It took 15 minutes of the horses awkwardly shuffling before anything ripped. Witnesses reported the man was still screaming when they started cutting him apart manually. Public executions weren't about justice. They were marketing. A town in Flanders once postponed an assassin's hanging for 3 days until market week, when they could guarantee maximum attendance. The killer spent those extra days chained in the square while children poked him with sticks. When the big day came, they used a rotten rope that stretched instead of snapping his neck. It took 6 tries before someone brought a proper noose. The town ledger notes they sold 300 extra beers that afternoon. The methods were creative in the worst ways. An English assassin in 1412 got the peeling treatment. They stripped his skin off in strips with red-hot tongs. The executioner's notes mention running out of salt to rub in the wounds by hour 3. Spectators could buy pieces of his flesh afterward as souvenirs. One noble reportedly fed some of his dogs as a lesson. The assassin lasted 8 hours before someone mercifully stabbed him in the eye. Some executions backfired spectacularly. A German assassin in 1395 was supposed to be burned at the stake, but the greenwood just smoked. After 2 hours of him coughing and the crowd getting bored, the mayor ordered him stabbed instead. The executioner botched that too. The dagger broke on a rib. They eventually just threw him in the river with weights tied to his legs. Town records show they later fined the executioner for poor spectacle quality. The worst part? Many assassins survived most of their own executions. A Spanish killer in 1423 was hanged, then cut down while still breathing for quartering. He woke up halfway through the disemboweling and started begging for water. The crowd loved that. They made the executioner go slower after that. His severed head reportedly blinked for a full minute after it was stuck on a spike. Towns competed for the most memorable executions. A Burgundian duke once imported a special execution wheel from Paris just for one assassin. The device had hooks to stretch the body while the wheel turned. Problem was, nobody knew how to operate it properly. The killer spent 6 hours being intermittently stretched and spun before someone smashed his skull with a hammer. The duke later complained the screams ruined his lunch. Families got dragged into the spectacle too. A Milanese assassin's wife and children were forced to watch his execution in 1401. Halfway through the hanging, the rope broke. While guards fetched a new one, the wife had to hold her husband's legs to help strangle him manually. Town records note she was later banished for inadequate enthusiasm during the process. Some executions became legendary for their incompetence. A French executioner in 1378 tried to break an assassin on the wheel, but kept missing the joints. After 12 failed strikes, the crowd started throwing garbage. The assassin reportedly said, "Just hit me between the ribs next time." They finally got it right on attempt 15. His last words were about damn time. The smarter killers tried to cheat the system. One Venetian assassin bit through his own tongue the night before execution, hoping to bleed out. Guards just stitched his mouth shut and proceeded as planned. Another in London pretended to faint during his hanging, so they left him dangling for 3 days to make sure. When they cut him down, birds had already taken his eyes. Even death didn't end the humiliation. Many towns displayed corpses for weeks afterward. A German assassin's body in 1415 was left chained to the city gates until the smell got too bad. Then they boiled the bones clean and hung the skeleton in the courthouse. Decades later, visitors could still see the knife marks where the executioner had struggled to dismember him. Some executions became holidays. A Spanish town celebrated the anniversary of a famous assassin's death by reenacting it with a dummy. After 20 years, the tradition had gotten so elaborate they built a mechanical dummy that screamed when burned. Records show they kept repairing it for over a century, long after anyone remembered the original killer's name. The psychological impact worked too. After a particularly gruesome execution in 1391 Paris, 6 known assassins turned themselves in rather than risk similar treatment. One left a note saying he'd rather hang quietly. They didn't grant his request. He got the wheel anyway, but with extra spikes because the crowd expected it. In the end, these spectacles weren't about justice. They were reminders that failure wouldn't just kill you, it would entertain your enemies first. Like the assassin in Ghent whose last words were, "At least I'm a main attraction today." The mayor made sure that quote was carved into the gallows afterward, because in medieval Europe, even your death wasn't really yours. It was just another show for the masses. Medieval assassins didn't leave behind grand legacies or heroic ballads. They left behind a bad smell and a lingering sense of unease. Think of them like a stain no one could quite scrub out, the kind that makes villagers cross themselves when they walk past a certain spot. Their impact wasn't in history books. It was in a way a town might still avoid the alley where an assassin was caught 2 generations later. Take the village of Montreuil in northern France. In 1398, they burned an assassin at the stake for allegedly cursing the local well. A century later, travelers noted the well remained unused, its stones blackened from the fire. No one could prove the water was tainted, but why risk it? That's the real assassin legacy. Not some shadowy influence, but the kind of superstition that makes people throw salt over their shoulders for no clear reason. Nobles didn't brag about hiring assassins. They wrote warnings about them in their diaries instead. One Burgundian lord's journal from 1415 spends 3 pages describing how to spot a potential killer, mostly nonsense about shifty eyes and unnaturally clean knives. The irony? He'd hired assassins twice before, but once the job was done, those men became liabilities. Their names were meant to disappear, just like their targets. The tools of the trade became objects of fear long after their owners were gone. A dagger found in a ditch wasn't just a weapon. It was evidence of dark arts. People swore certain blades could kill with a single scratch, or that poison vials bubbled on their own. In 1422, a Parisian blacksmith refused to melt down an assassin's knife, claiming it wept blood when heated. It was just rust mixing with condensation. But try telling that to a mob holding torches. Assassins didn't shape history. They haunted its edges. Records from the period mention them only in passing, if at all. A typical entry might read, "Lord so died suddenly. God's will. No details, no suspects. Just a gap where the truth should be." The few who were caught became cautionary tales, not legends. Their executions were public spectacles designed to make people forget, not remember. Some towns developed bizarre rituals to ward off assassin spirits. In Cologne, they buried a known killer face down under the gallows with hawthorn through his back. Every year on the anniversary of his death, the magistrate would hammer the stake deeper, just in case. When they dug up the site in 1703, the skeleton still had the rusted iron protruding from its spine. The fear outlived the facts. A Florentine merchant's ledger from 1431 lists payments to the silent man for removing obstacles. 50 years later, his great-grandson wrote a margin note. Grandfather's ghost walks the halls when debts come due. Never mind that the original assassin had died in prison. The idea of him lingered like rotten meat in the walls. Even places became tainted by association. A tavern in York where an assassin was caught in 1372 went bankrupt within a year. Patrons claimed they saw his shadow in the corner, even though he'd been hanged miles away. The new owner tried rebranding it as the Honest Thief, which only made things worse. The building burned down in 1380, arson probably, and no one rebuilt. Tax records show the lot stayed empty for 2 centuries. The church fueled the dread. Priests called assassins walking blasphemies and refused them last rites. One bishop in Mainz claimed their very breath could spoil communion wine. This wasn't theology. It was crowd control. If people believed killers were damned before they struck, they'd be less likely to hire them. The few assassins who survived long enough to reflect on their careers left depressing records. A captured killer in Rouen was asked if he had any last words. He said, "Tell my mother I died of fever." Not because he cared about her feelings, but because admitting the truth would get his family run out of town. The executioner obliged, then took the mother's gratitude money and used it to buy drinks for the guards. Artisans avoided anything tied to assassins. A parchment maker in Avignon got stuck with a killer's confiscated journal and couldn't sell for years. People claimed the ink moved at night. Eventually, he buried it under his shop floor, where archaeologists found it in 1992, still perfectly preserved because no one had dared touch it. The paranoia reached absurd heights. In 1445, a Dresden baker was accused of being an assassin because he kneaded dough too vigorously. He wasn't, just bad at his job, but they tortured him anyway. His confession included imaginary poison recipes and a fake list of targets before he broke, and admitted he burned the bread to cover up using cheap flour. Modern historians struggle to separate fact from fear. A skeleton found in a London sewer in 2008 had 3 knives in its ribs, all from different decades. Was this an assassin killed by rivals? A superstitious burial? Or just some poor drunk who fell in at the wrong time? The museum label says probable homicide victim, but the tour guide still called the ghost of Gutter Lane after hours. The truth is, assassins were footnotes, not forces of change. Their real legacy wasn't in who they killed, but in how they made people afraid of the dark for centuries afterward. Next time you see a movie assassin hailed as some antihero, remember the reality. These were men whose best-case scenario was being forgotten completely, and most of the time, they got exactly what they deserved. You'd think modern hitmen would have it better with burner phones and the dark web, but pull up any cartel or mafia case file, and you'll see the same desperate faces that medieval assassins had, just with worse tattoos. Take Ramon, a Mexican cartel enforcer from the 2000s. His first kill used a $15 kitchen knife from Walmart because his handler forgot to bring the proper gear. When the target fought back, Ramon broke 2 fingers trying to keep his grip. His payment? Half the promised cash and a threat to kill his mother if he complained. Cartel assassins today have life expectancies barely longer than medieval killers. About 5 years active service before either prison or a ditch. One study tracked 152 sicarios in Mexico. Only 17 made it past age 30. The rest? Executed by rivals, betrayed by bosses, or disappeared by authorities. Their turnover rate would make a medieval guild master nod in recognition. Betrayal hasn't changed either. A Russian mob hitman named Sergei kept detailed notebooks of his jobs between 2004 to 2009. They show clients stiffing him on payments 7 times out of 10. One entry reads, Dmitri promised $50,000, got $12,000, and a used car stereo. Car had GPS tracker. Police found Sergei's body in that same car trunk 6 days later. His last note? Should have taken the stereo. Modern tools just create new problems. That encrypted burner phone? Cops recovered one cartel killer's entire contact list because he backed it up to his iCloud. Medieval assassins at least didn't have to worry about their daggers auto-uploading kill counts to the cloud. Another hitman in Chicago got caught because his target's Fitbit recorded the exact time of death, down to the second, which contradicted his alibi. Training is still just as makeshift. Cartels don't send recruits to assassin academies. They hand teenagers AK-47s and point them at rivals. One captured Sicario confessed he learned to shoot from watching YouTube tutorials. His accuracy rate? About 30% on a good day. Another in Brazil trained by playing Grand Theft Auto. He crashed a getaway car during his first job because the real brakes work differently. Gear fails just as spectacularly now as then. A Bulgarian hitman's Glock jammed mid-shootout in 2016 because he'd never cleaned it. His target, an ex-military bodyguard, took the gun and beat him to death with it. Crime scene photos show the slide still locked open from a malfunction. Payment methods have barely evolved. A Philadelphia contract killer in 2018 got paid in Bitcoin, which promptly lost half its value before he could cash out. He tried demanding more, so his client sent screenshots of his kid's school schedule instead. Medieval assassins at least got physical silver that held its worth when someone betrayed them. The isolation is just as brutal. A loner hitman in Detroit lasted 8 years by never using the same phone twice. He got caught because a gas station clerk recognized his weird blink from an old wanted poster. Turns out facial tics are harder to change than burner numbers. Psychological damage? Identical. A captured cartel assassin's diary describes waking up screaming from dead victims' faces, just like that medieval Venetian killer haunted by bubbles in a beard. Another in London developed alcoholism after his third job because the shaking wouldn't stop. His last message to his handler? A drunken slur about refunding the advance. They found him with the bottle still in his hand and 2 bullets in the cupboard. He'd apparently been too impaired to load. Even the successful ones can't quit. A rare retired Sicario in Colombia lasted 3 years running a food truck until a rival recognized his distinctive knife scars. His decapitated head appeared in the taco meat cooler the next morning. Surveillance footage showed his last customer was a former cartel lieutenant who'd always hated the guacamole. Forensics make everything harder now. One assassin in Houston wore gloves, white prints, and used untraceable bullets in 2019. He still got caught because his Nike Air Monarchs left tread patterns matched the security footage from a 7-Eleven he'd visited pre-hit. The medieval version? That assassin who tracked blood through 6 streets before passing out drunk. Some things never change. Targets are still paranoid nightmares. A Dubai hitman's case file describes his mark having biometric locks, food testers, and decoy cars. The would-be killer got arrested trying to bribe a security guard who turned out to be the target's cousin. His interrogation transcript reads like medieval trial records, identical excuses, right down to, "I was just admiring the architecture." Social stigma? Still crushing. Ex-hitmen who enter witness protection report neighbors crossing the street even after new identities. One in Nebraska changed towns for times before giving up and living in a trailer park. His journal ends, "At least the meth heads don't judge." Compare that to medieval assassins cursed as plague bringers. The few differences just make things worse. Medieval killers didn't have to worry about traffic cams, DNA, or digital trails. A hitman in Tokyo spent months planning the perfect subway push, only for facial recognition software to flag him entering the station. His burner phone's search history showed frantic last-minute looks at Japan extradition treaties. In the end, the job's fundamentals haven't changed since the Dark Ages. Desperate people taking terrible risks for shaky rewards. The weapons got louder, but the outcome stayed just as grim. Whether the cartel Sicario or a medieval dagger for hire, killing for money still breaks the same things. Your nerves, your soul, and eventually your neck. The only real upgrade? Modern cops don't use torture racks. Usually. Next time you see some glamorized assassin in movies, medieval or modern, remember the reality. Shaking hands, poor planning, and an extremely short shelf life. The profession hasn't evolved in centuries because human desperation hasn't either. As one arrested hitman told interrogators, Nobody grows up wanting to do this. We just run out of better options. His medieval counterpart probably said the same thing right before they stretched him on the rack. Some jobs never improve. Hollywood assassin movies are about as realistic as a unicorn working a 9 to 5 office job. Take the classic hidden blade trope. Real medieval assassins couldn't afford custom wrist mechanisms. They used whatever sharp object was handy, usually a stolen kitchen knife or a broken farming tool. That cool retractable blade you see in films? It would have snapped the first time someone tried to stab through a noble's padded doublet. Then there's the myth of the master planner. Movies show assassins memorizing guard rotations and predicting every possible outcome. Reality was more like a drunk guy guessing which cup hides the ball. One historical account describes an assassin who spent weeks planning to poison a duke's wine, only to discover the last moment the man only drank beer. The killer was caught trying to pour his toxin into a stein, while the duke's bodyguards watched. Parkour-style rooftop escapes are pure fantasy too. Medieval roofs were slippery, uneven, and prone to collapsing under the weight of a fleeing killer. An assassin in 14th century Paris actually tried this. He made it exactly 3 tiles before crashing through into a nobleman's dinner party. The court records note he landed in the soup tureen, which at least solved his hunger problem before they hanged him. The whole one assassin against an army scenario is equally ridiculous. Real killers worked alone because no one trusted each other, not because they were superhuman fighters. A chronicle from 1392 describes an assassin who took on 2 guards. He lasted about as long as you'd expect. The scribe notes the fight ended when one guard sat on him while the other went for rope. Hollywood also loves showing assassins surviving ridiculous wounds. Arrow to the shoulder? Just snap it off and keep fighting. In reality, even minor injuries could be deadly. A German assassin's diary mentions he abandoned the job after getting a splinter during his approach. It got infected, and he spent 3 weeks delirious with fever while his target vacationed elsewhere. Secret societies of assassins are complete fiction too. There were no ancient orders passing down wisdom through the ages. Most killers learned through brutal trial and error. Emphasis on error. A Venetian account describes an assassin who trained himself by stabbing melons in his basement. It worked until he tried it on an actual person, who fought back by hitting him with a chamber pot. The movies also get poison all wrong. Those elegant, tasteless liquids that work in seconds didn't exist. Real medieval poisons were unpredictable, slow-acting, and often made the victim vomit spectacularly before dying. One killer in York used a poison so weak his target just got diarrhea, and then personally led the hunt to capture him. Then there's the Assassin's Creed nonsense. Real killers didn't have moral codes beyond try not to get caught. A French assassin's journal lists his only rule as never work for someone smarter than you. He broke this rule 3 times before someone finally poisoned his wine, using the same weak toxin he'd failed with earlier. Hollywood's greatest lie might be the idea that assassins were respected or feared. In reality, they were despised by everyone, clients, targets, even other criminals. A London thief's memoir describes assassins as the beggars of the underworld, always desperate for work, and usually betraying someone for a hot meal. The fancy costumes are fake too. Real assassins dressed to blend in, which usually meant worn peasant clothes or stolen uniforms. That iconic hooded robe you see in games and movies, it would have made you stand out like a flamingo in a chicken coop. An assassin in Florence was caught precisely because his disguise was too clean. Guards noticed his beggars' robes lacked the usual stains and smells. Movie assassins always have perfect timing too. They arrive exactly when the guard turns his back, or when the target is alone. Real killers spent weeks waiting for opportunities that never came. One account mentions an assassin who hid in a noble's privy for 2 days, only to emerge when the man's entire family was visiting. They'd beat him with the chamber pots he'd been hiding behind. The weapons are all wrong as well. Those beautifully balanced throwing knives? Most medieval knives were too heavy to throw accurately. An assassin in Ghent tried it once. The knife spun sideways and hit a servant in the rear. The resulting commotion got him captured before he could try again. Even the idea of clean kills is nonsense. Most medieval assassinations were messy, Violent affairs where both parties ended up covered in blood, sweat, and whatever was in last night's dinner. A Burgundian chronicle describes one kill where the assassin and his target both fell into a fireplace during the struggle. The killer escaped, but not before his cloak caught fire, making him easy to track through the snow. Hollywood also ignores the aftermath. Movie assassins walk away coolly after each kill. Real ones often panicked, like the killer in Milan who forgot his knife in the body, or the one in Paris who left his hat at the scene with his name stitched inside. The biggest lie? That anyone could make a career of it. Films show assassins working for decades before retiring rich. Historical records suggest most lasted less than a year before getting caught, betrayed, or killed by their next target. One exception was a German assassin who survived 12 years by living in a cave and only emerging to take jobs during plague years when no one asked questions. Why does Hollywood keep lying? Because the truth is boring. No one wants to watch a 2-hour movie about an assassin failing to poison someone's wine, then getting hanged the next morning. But that's exactly how most of these stories ended. Not with a dramatic leap from a tower, but with a short drop and a sudden stop at the end of a rope. The reality check is simple. If medieval assassins were half as competent as movies claim, history books would be full of their exploits. Instead, they're footnotes, brief mentions of bungled attempts and quick executions. Next time you see some cinematic killer pulling off impossible feats, remember the historical truth. Most couldn't even stab their way out of a wet parchment bag. So was being a medieval assassin worth it? Let's tally up the benefits. Constantly looking over your shoulder, getting paid in broken promises, and a distinct possibility of ending up as a public art installation on the city gates. Not exactly what you call career perks. Take the case of a French assassin from 1415 who kept detailed records. His ledger shows 12 successful kills, total lifetime earnings of about 3 months' wages for a blacksmith, and an impressive collection of scars from clients who refused to pay. His last entry reads, should have apprenticed to a baker, right before the town guard kicked in his door. Survivors didn't fare much better. One German assassin who miraculously made it to age 40 described his life as like being a rat that learned to hold a knife. He spent his final years in a monastery, where the other monks made him sleep in the cellar and wouldn't let him touch the sacramental wine. When he died, they buried him outside the cemetery walls under a pile of rocks, just in case he got any ideas about coming back. The math simply didn't add up. For every legendary hit that paid enough to live on for a year, there were 20 botch jobs that ended in broken bones or empty pockets. A Venetian ledger from 1432 lists payments to 7 different assassins of the same target. 6 wound up dead or in prison, while the 7 collected his fee and immediately invested in another assassination attempt. They found his body floating in the canal 3 days later, the money still in his purse. Even the rare success stories read like cautionary tales. In Spain, a killer known as El Lobo built a modest reputation over 8 years, until his own wife used his favorite dagger to stab him in his sleep. Turns out she'd been keeping tally of his earnings, and noticed half his payments were missing. His real secret? He'd been bribing guards to look the other way. Expense he never recorded. The wife got off with a warning because, as the judge put it, nobody liked him anyway. For medieval assassins, retirement planning basically meant choosing your preferred method of death. One English assassin faked his own drowning, so convincingly that he collected life insurance, then got caught when he tried to claim it under a fake name 7 years later. Another tried joining a traveling theater troupe until someone recognized his distinctive walk, result of a badly healed arrow wound from a job gone wrong. His last performance was an improvised hanging scene that the audience found a bit too realistic. The psychological toll made old age unlikely anyway. Records show most assassins either drank themselves to death or developed such debilitating paranoia they became useless. A Burgundian killer who survived into his 50s reportedly slept in a different doorway each night, his pockets full of poison bait for stray dogs that might give away his position. When they found his body, the coroner noted he'd starved to death, too afraid to visit the market where he might be recognized. Clients weren't the retirement plan either. Those few assassins who tried blackmailing former employers usually wound up with their tongues nailed to the city gates. A particularly dumb example from 1397 shows a killer presenting as proof of the noble's crimes, right in front of the noble's private army. The resulting skewering was so thorough, they used his corpse as a pincushion demonstration for new recruits. Some tried going straight, with pathetic results. A former assassin in Milan became a sausage vendor until customers complained about the suspicious herbs in his links. Turns out old habits die hard. He'd been using his leftover poisons as seasoning. Another opened a barbershop, but kept giving customers close shaves that accidentally slit throats. When arrested, his defense was that he'd gotten used to working with uncooperative clients. The smart ones understood the game was rigged. A German assassin's will from 1421 left precise instructions. Cremate his body, scatter the ashes, and tell everyone he'd moved to Constantinople. His executor followed the directions perfectly, then immediately cashed in the bounty that had been on the man's head for a decade. The final entry in the assassin's diary read, "At least I got someone to be honest with me once." What's the takeaway? Being a medieval assassin wasn't a career. It was a slow suicide with delusions of grandeur. The few who survived long enough to reflect on their choices all said the same thing. Not worth it. The money evaporated. The reputation was worse than useless. And the exit strategies all led to the same dark alley with a knife waiting at the end. Even the successful ones just bought themselves front row seats to their own inevitable downfall. At least modern jobs give you health insurance before you inevitably get stabbed in the back. The medieval assassin's retirement plan was hoping you die quickly enough that they wouldn't bother digging up your grave to scatter your bones. Most didn't even get that much. Their names vanished from records, their bodies fed to pigs, their few possessions burned to avoid curses. The only legacy they left was making everyone else's bad jobs look slightly better by comparison. So next time you think your boss is terrible, remember, at least you're not spending your lunch break sharpening a spoon, because it's the only weapon you can afford, while wondering if today's the day your client decides you're cheaper dead than paid. The medieval assassin's final verdict? A fool's game where the house always wins, and the house was usually the local executioner counting coins from your former employer. The only real mystery is why anyone thought it was a good idea in the first place. So next time you see some slick assassin in a movie, remember the reality. These were desperate people with bad tools and worse luck. No cool cloaks, no fancy gadgets. Just a lot of improvising with whatever sharp object was handy. If you enjoyed this dip into historical misery, let me know in the comments what shocked you most. Don't forget to like and subscribe, unless you're a medieval noble watching this in your private chambers. In that case, maybe check behind the tapestries before bed. You never know who might be hiding there with a very disappointing kitchen knife and absolutely no plan.